Hey loved ones, I'm Keyosha. It's pronounced Keyosha, meaning key of the ocean. I'm a life coach and a motivational speaker, known for my company Key Coaching, which focuses on self-betterment. In this podcast, I'm going to share with you what I've learned from being a coach. I'll provide you the keys not just to survive, but to thrive. Hey, and well, you know what it is. Welcome back to Wisdom Wednesdays. How's it going? We are here and we're going to talk about a tough topic yet again. This one might be a little bit tougher than others or triggering, some people like to say. Get your pen, get your paper, make sure to take some notes. You're going to want a record of this. The topic of discussion today is trauma. I know it's a tough topic because immediately when you think about trauma, you start thinking about pain, and nobody likes pain. But I'm just going to break down the nitty-gritty of trauma so that we can have a better idea of how to wrap our heads around it and therefore be able to maneuver and navigate through it. So, two very big things to think about when you think about trauma is whether or not it is big T trauma or little t trauma. These terms have been used to differentiate the difference between like trauma that everyone would define as a trauma. For example, like a car accident or a sudden death of a family member. These things are traumatic. And then there's little trauma, which is usually defined as a trauma that ultimately is something that we go through. We might be hurt because we've broken our leg or our heart has been broken, but these are traumas that we can come back from. Now, it doesn't make these traumas any less effective on our lives because no matter what size the T on the trauma is, it usually dictates whether or not we make certain decisions in the future. For example, you're walking down the street, you're on your way to school, you're happy, and a dog, a neighbor's dog, Dalmatian specifically, comes out of nowhere and bites you. That would be a big T trauma for a kid because it's sudden. No one's expecting it, but it also would affect your perspective on dogs in general, but specifically whenever you see Dalmatians, you would be, here comes that buzzword again, triggered. So a trigger is ultimately a reference to an emotional reaction that is as a result of a disturbing topic, in example, violence and suicide. And so we might hear these words used more often than not in this day and age to describe when we're experiencing something that we dislike. The reason why it is a disliked experience is because it's bringing up or resurfacing some of the traumas that we've personally experienced. And not only does it resurface the memory of those traumas, when someone has PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, it can actually resurface the same emotions at the same intensity, if not more intense as a red flag when you're experiencing that trigger. So despite the fact that something dangerous isn't happening again, it can really and vividly feel as though something terrible is taking place. Now, what we need to realize when it comes to trauma and what we can't forget, because when others are expressing their triggers, it might be hard to wrap our heads around. It's not our trauma, is that trauma can exist in different ways. So, for example, when it comes to domestic violence, that is a form of trauma where there's abuse taking place. However, The trauma or violence can be a verbal abuse, physical abuse, mental abuse, which falls under the category of manipulation and gaslighting, or financial abuse and emotional abuse. The reason why these are so traumatic is because they skew our actual vision of reality. When someone is verbally abusive, for example, they're, tearing down on your physical appearance. Say, for example, they're calling you fat or obese, and you may be overweight, but it's just never been the angle. It's all in the approach, right? And so when someone is verbally bullying you that way, whether or not it be in a school setting, which is also traumatic, it still is trauma, whether or not it's verbal or mental or emotional. The reason why is because one thing we may not all know is that the human body can't actually tell the difference between physical trauma and emotional trauma. And so the chemicals that are released in our brain when we are experiencing trauma don't differentiate just because the trauma isn't physical. When you break a bone in your body very rapidly, even prior to the message getting to your brain, begins to release things like adrenaline and cortisol. These are the active chemicals that will allow us to enter into a state of fight or flight. These are life-saving chemicals, and they're in place for a reason. However, if you've experienced emotional, mental trauma, the same chemicals are released. Yes, there is danger in that moment. Once you come out of that trauma, however, those same chemicals are released when you're triggered. And this might be why we see individuals experiencing panic attacks. The trauma chemicals are flooding their brain, telling them that they are in danger in the present moment, therefore skewing their perspective of reality at the time. For someone with a history of trauma, anything that reminds them of their trauma can make them feel like they're experiencing their trauma all over again. Symptoms of specifically PTSD are substance abuse, eating disorders, and anxiety. And one surefire way that you can pinpoint the fact that our bodies are not aware of the difference or contrast between emotional and mental trauma, whether it be gaslighting, guilt trips, manipulation, or living with or being raised by or being partnered up with a narcissist, is that the anxiety, the eating disorder, the substance abuse can actually have a physical effect on your health. And so some signs of these, like physical signs that we've seen, is when people start to have like a high blood pressure. People who have experienced too much stress can end up having cardiac issues and may even experience heart attacks at too early of an age. And so the reason why this topic is of utmost importance is because trauma when unaddressed, can physically damage our health. Trauma, when unaddressed and untalked about, can shorten our overall lifespan. And so, despite speaking on the topic of trauma with the comprehension that it is normal and that we all experience trauma, to not ever resolve that trauma or unpack that trauma when you are safe to do so, obviously, can physically damage you. And so, like, a personal story on this is I was in a stressful partnership with a narcissist. And when you're with a narcissist at a young age, you don't actually know that. But after being in the relationship for about 6 years, 7 years, I go to the dentist, and the dentist is like new because I moved to a different province, got a new dentist, different city, everything. And he's just like talking to me like matter of fact, like I know what's happening inside my mouth. And he's just like, oh, okay, so yeah, you grind your teeth? And I was like, no. And he was like, okay, well then you've been doing it in your sleep. And I was like, what? Like I didn't want to believe. Like, what are you talking about? Like, I might not be cool, but I'm not that bad. You know what I mean? Like, I don't cry my teeth. I'm not one of those. And I genuinely had no awareness of the fact that my stress, whether or not it be emotional or mental, was physically manifesting itself in my body when my guard was let down the most and I was at my most vulnerable point in a state of sleep. In a state of rest, my body wasn't resting, it was stressing. So when I'm saying trauma needs to be unpacked in a safe place, I mean that either way, your body's going to try to find a way to unpack the trauma in a safe place, like sleeping and grinding your teeth. But there are far more effective ways of resolving our trauma. And I feel like a lot of people hate to hear these kinds of words because there's a lot of negative connotation. Less nowadays than before. But our mental health depends on us resolving the things that we've gone through. Because not only is there many different branches on the trauma tree, whether or not they're big, thick branches, big T trauma, or thin twigs, little T trauma, whether or not the branches are twisting and turning in different directions, verbal, physical, mental, emotional, financial. All of these traumas, just like the branches on a tree, can come from various different places, the same way that they grow in various different directions. Some of the origins of our trauma is childhood trauma, but some of our trauma is adulthood trauma. And, you know, we're aware, whatever, you smash your finger in the door and snap off your nail, and that's trauma that hurts. And you're like, you know, but as an adult, you're kind of like, okay, it's going to heal. It's going to be okay. There's also childhood trauma where a child may be injured, or in unfortunate events, children may be traumatized through the 5 various versions of abuse. But what is not often being unpacked enough is something that none of us know enough about. And that's the reason why people don't really have the adequate tools to unpack it. And that is specifically multi-generational trauma. So take human anatomy. We're aware that, male anatomy is whatever. They are constantly producing sperm cells. And so once the sperm cells leave, they just make new ones. However, when it comes to the female anatomy, my grandma, for example, and everything that my grandma went through when my mom was being created inside of her, my mom's eggs were something that my mom was born with. So one of those eggs is obviously me. And if my grandma experienced something severely traumatic, like terribly traumatic, I don't know, slavery, then that trauma, whether or not we knew it was going to be passed down, is unfortunately passed down. And that's why a lot of the things that we witness, despite the fact that it didn't happen specifically to us, to be constantly exposed to lynching and the terrible acts of slavery, are physically and emotionally triggering and traumatic for us. That egg that was inside of my mom when my mom was born, where my mom was housed and grew for the first 9 months of her existence, were inside of my grandmother, a terribly traumatized woman. And so this is the reason why trauma needs to be unpacked. Not only adult trauma, not only childhood trauma, but multi-generational trauma needs to be unpacked so that we can move forward without carrying the heavy burden of the triggers of the trauma from generations before us. Because a study that was done on mice, whenever they were exposed to cherry blossom trees, when they harmed those mice every time they got close to the cherry blossom trees, the mice would just straight up avoid the cherry blossom trees. Obviously, you know what I'm saying? You go outside every time that you step out of your house, your neighbor's Dalmatian dog darn near bites your hand off. I mean, you're going to cross the street and walk around, right? But what people fail to realize is the study to find out how mice would react and how mice's children, mouses, you know what I'm trying to say, how their children would react, proved that their children didn't even want to go near cherry blossoms. Now, the most fascinating part of all of it is that many generations down the line, I mean, we're talking mice that have never been exposed to the trauma of the cherry blossom tree, to this day still avoid the cherry blossom tree. And so, all of this being said, trauma has a bigger effect on us and the people around us than we are aware. it may dictate whether or not someone flips a switch and goes into fight, flight, or freeze in the blink of an eye. And so with this knowledge, we need to approach people and have that approach, that knowledgeable approach, and make knowledgeable decisions about how we're going to deal with other people's triggers. But the only way we can do that is by speaking up when we're being triggered. So the first thing that we need to do as a collective is speak up when you're being triggered. If somebody says something like, you have buck teeth, and you remember that you used to be bullied as a kid and it triggers you and makes you really feel upset, but they might be joking, actually just say, that triggers me because when I was younger, this is the trauma I experienced. And so I don't really like being called Bugs Bunny. You know what I'm trying to say? Ultimately, awareness is a way through trauma. That and talking about it. So I encourage you and empower you to talk about your trauma. It's the only way to raise awareness. All right, so song suggestion of the week is Blackbird by Sarah McLachlan. Thanks for joining me, loved ones. Okay, bye.